All right. So when we initialized our state property right here a couple of videos ago, I had mentioned that there are two ways to initialize state. So I want to show you the other way that we can initialize state because the alternative way is a method that you're going to see very frequently in a lot of blog post documentation. Now, in order to understand this other way that we're going to use to initialize state, we have to talk about something called lifecycle methods. You heard me talk about it before, but now let's get into it. So this is the video that we're going to talk about lifecycle methods, and then we'll start to refactor that state initialization. Okay, so component lifecycle method. It's a function that we can optionally define inside of our class-based components. So if we decide to implement these methods, they'll be called automatically by React at certain points during a component's lifecycle. And when I use the term lifecycle, I am referring to the fact that a component is going to be created and then show up on the screen of our browser. And then at some point in time, we might do something like, say, call a set state, which will cause a component to re-render. And then at some point in time, a component might be removed from the DOM altogether and stop showing its content on the screen. So that entire series of events is the component's lifecycle. So we've already seen the constructor function. That is a function that we can optionally define if we want to. It will be automatically called when a new instance of our component is created. And we've also spoken about the render method. The render method, of course, is not optional, which is unlike any of the other call methods here. So the render method is the one function that we absolutely have to define. Now, technically, the render method is a lifecycle function. It gets called at some point during the lifecycle of a component. So here's what happens in our app. Constructor is being called, then the render method will be called, and we return some amount of JSX, and then that content becomes visible on the screen. After that, we're going to see a series of different lifecycle methods being called at different points in time. First off, immediately following a component shows up on our browser, a lifecycle method component didMount is called. So that means that if we define a function inside of our class, like right here outside of the constructor, right above the render method, and if we define a method right here called very specifically component didMount, this function will automatically be called one time when our component first gets rendered onto the screen. So we could put some amount of code inside of here to set up or do some initial data loading that we might want to do one time when our component first shows up. And then after that, the component didUpdate lifecycle methods will be called automatically. Now remember, an update is going to come in the form of calling that setState method, right? Because anytime we call a setState and update our state, the component will render itself. So anytime that happens, the component didUpdate lifecycle methods will be called automatically. And then after that, our component might get another update. If it gets another update, the component didUpdate will be called a second time or even a third time. However many times our component gets updated at some point in time, we might decide to stop showing this component on the screen. We'll talk about these different scenarios that would occur later on inside the course. Don't worry. But if for some reason we decide to no longer show some of our content, the component will unmount method will be automatically called. And then this method can be used usually if we want to do some kind of cleanup. And of course, we'll discuss that to get a better understanding of these different lifecycle methods coming up. But right now, I do want to implement component did mount and component did update inside of our component and just put some basic console logs inside of there. So back inside my editor once again, right above the render method, I'm going to define component did mount. And inside of it, I'm going to put a simple console log that says component did mount. Just like so. And then underneath of that, I'm going to define a second lifecycle method, component did update. And I'll put a console log inside of it that says component did update. All right. So let's save all of this and go back over to our browser. And I just want to see these console logs. So the first console log is from the component did mount lifecycle method. And it's going to be called automatically anytime our component shows up on the screen. And we then saw the component did update method. So our geolocation request succeeded. And after that, component did update method was called. So in this case, I'm going to change location preferences to ask default, and I'm going to refresh the page. And as you can see, we don't have the component did update on our console because our geolocation request didn't succeed and the set state function didn't get called. And I click on allow, and here it is. The component did update lifecycle method was invoked, and all right. So we can remove these two lifecycle methods right here, and let's go to the diagram. So I just want to highlight a couple of notes on each of these different lifecycle methods. So first off, you've already seen the constructor, and I think you're already understanding that the constructor function is a really good place to do our state initialization, and that's exactly what we're doing right now. We can also do some initial data loading inside of a constructor. We can make a network request to some outside API, just like we did here, and we can make it inside of the constructor. It could be one possible solution, right? However, I distinctly remember when we started talking about component did mount, I told you that component did mount method is a perfect location to do some initial data loading for our component, right? Or even to do some fetching of an outside process like getting the user's current position, if you only have to do this thing one time. Now, in our case, we only want to get our user's current position one time, and the component did mount method only gets invoked one time. Sounds like a match. Yet you might now have noticed that we did the same thing for the component did mount method and the constructor. In both locations, we can do some data loading or call our geolocation stuff right here. So in truth, we could use either a constructor or a component did mount to do that data loading. However, if you read the official React documentation, and if you look at some of the community best practices, they're all going to say, do not do data loading inside the constructor function. All right, that's understandable. But you absolutely can. It's just recommended that you do it inside the component did mount method. Now, there is a very simple reason for that. If you always centralize all of your data loading stuff inside the component did mount method, as opposed to spreading it out between components, Well, it's going to lead to a much clearer code, logically thinking, right? So if a new engineer ever starts working on your project, they can open up some new component file and understand right from the get-go that all the data loading code is related to a single component, and it's always going to be placed inside of the component did mount. So I'll tell you what, we're going to take that advice right now and define a component did method, and we're going to move our get current position call inside the component did mount lifecycle method. But right now, we're going to finish talking about these last few lifecycle methods. So next up is the render method. Now, I think you already pretty well understand what's going on with the render method, yes? Inside of the render method, we're going to return some JSX in general, and that's the only thing that we do inside of there. We're not going to ever make a network request, right? Okay. We're not ever going to start up something like fetching the user's location or something like that. Render method is just about returning JSX and not doing anything else. Now, the component did update method gets called every single time that a component is updated for any reason. Maybe our state changes or our component gets a new props from its parent. So this would be a great location to also do some data loading that needs to be done every single time that a component is updated. So a good example of that would be if we wanted to make some type of network request every single time that a user clicks on a button or every single time that they enter some text into an input. Now, finally, component will unmount. The component will unmount method is used anytime that we are about to remove a component from the screen and we need to do some cleanup after it. Good example of that would be if we're making use of Google Maps, say, inside of a React application. Okay, so you guys get it. Now, technically, it's the entire list of lifecycle methods. All right, you look like you could use a break. I'll see you on the other side, and we're going to have more fun with refactoring.